Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Transformative Journeys with Moon Travel Guides. I'm Tiffany Pittman, Wonderful's Global Membership Director. I'm in North Miami Beach, Florida, and right now I want to know where you all are at. Please go ahead and put in the chat box where you're from. Okay, welcome everyone. Yeah, thank you for joining us. Just go ahead and put it in the chat and let us know where you are from. Right, not seeing anybody in the chat. Okay, now I see everybody. Okay. Yeah, we got Seattle, we got Chicago. Hello, Tazim. I hope I pronounced your name right. You're from Vancouver? Nice. Oh, we got Chicago, we got Monterey, California, Oregon. Oh, Cabo San Lucas, nice. That's on one of my top places to visit. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here. And please keep those comments and also put your questions in the chat box and we'll highlight them and answer as many as we can. And for those of you who are not familiar with Wonderful, Wonderful is a global community and lifestyle brand that specializes in helping women travel the world. We connect our community both online and in person through a thriving online membership, chapter events in 50 cities and counting, global summits, and small group trips. While we connect women travelers together, we also focus on amplifying the voices of women and underrepresented people in the travel industry. And we ultimately strive towards making this industry one that is more equitable, inclusive, and thoughtful. And you can find out more about Wonderful by going to sheswonderful.com, and we'll put a link to that in our chat box. And for making this all possible, we want to give a big thank you to Moon Travel Guides. Moon is the #1 travel guide publisher in the Americas and offers guides to destinations around the world. Their authors are experts who have a passion for their destinations, are culturally and politically aware, adventurous, and inspiring, and they have great stories to tell. And now, are you all ready to hear some of those stories? I know I am. And joining us right now are actually we have three that are joining us, and hopefully one will be joining us soon. These amazing authors, they love to travel. They're going to share their perspectives on how the destinations they cover are impacted by tourism, offer tips on how to engage with local communities without being a voyeur, and show listeners how an authentic travel experience can be truly life-changing. So let's get started and meet them. And first up is our moderator, Deborah D. Douglas. Deborah is the co-editor-in-chief of The Emancipator and author of Moon U.S. Civil Rights Trail, a traveler's guide to the people, places, and events that made the movement. She is among 90 contributors to the New York Times best-selling 400 Souls, a community history of African America, 1619 through 2019, edited by Ibram X, Kendi, and Keisha N. Blaine. Please welcome Deborah D. Douglas.
Hey!
Let's say hey. And to let you all know, Deborah is a real trooper right now. She is in the process of moving. Yeah, she's in Boston and, trying to get her place together. So you all know how that is. When you're trying to work and you're moving at the same time, that is a lot to deal with. So thank you so much, Deborah, for being here. And next up, we have Bethany Pitts. Bethany has been working with indigenous communities in Ecuador since 2013, especially those defending the Amazon from oil exploitation. From these defenders, Bethany learned that community-led ecotourism enables them to protect biodiverse ecosystems and ancient cultures. This inspired her to write Moon Ecuador and I cannot talk today, and the Galapagos Islands with a focus on ethical travelers. Say hello to Bethany. And next up, we have Jennifer Walker. Jennifer is a British-Hungarian writer living in Budapest. She's the author of Moon Budapest and Beyond and the co-author of Moon Prague, and has written about Hungary and Austria for numerous publications. Additionally, she co-founded Panel Magazine, a literary magazine focusing on contemporary literature and art from the Central and Eastern Europe region. And hopefully we will have Minal Hajratwatla joining us from India, another amazing author. She may be joining us sometime during this event, hopefully. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah, and let's get started.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having us. So let's just jump right into it. This discussion is labeled Transformative Journeys. So let's just talk about your transformative journeys. Jennifer, Bethany, can you relate a memory or a transformation that you experienced on one of the journeys associated with your books or just over the course of your life? Jennifer?
So with the book, it's kind of interesting because I come from a bit of a different perspective that I'm actually half Hungarian. So I partly grew up in Budapest and so on. So my experience of the city is a little bit different to someone who would move here. But for me, there have been some interesting transformative moments that have affected my writing in that I kind of learned to be a tourist in a city that I consider home. And there was one amazing event that they do every year in Budapest called Budapest 100. And they open up like residential buildings where you can go in. There's like either a centenary or like there's a theme around squares and so on. And it's kind of like these parts of the city that you wouldn't normally be able to see. But you have the most beautiful like staircases and buildings and architecture that you wouldn't see normally as a tourist. It kind of made me think like there's more than just sort of the main sites. These are places where people live. You get to see that this is a place where someone has their daily lives, and it's not just a place of incredible beauty, but you sort of see how people interact, how communities are formed. Like some houses, they have like, there was one in a square that used to be a Jewish quarter, and not the main Jewish quarter, but an area that was like a poorer Sephardi community. Mm-hmm. And they found an old synagogue because they used to have synagogues inside apartments. And in this building, a guy was renovating the place, and he found all these like things in Hebrew on his wall when he was doing the renovation, and he found out that this used to be a synagogue. And the whole flat started coming in and doing the history of the area and learning like the whole building. We're learning about the history of the area of this Jewish community that was very active in that part. And they displayed this in this event. And it was just very interesting to see these human stories come out of a place that you feel that you know very well. And you realize there's always more to scratch beneath the surface.
Yeah. Were you able to see any of those homes that were, okay.
Actually, there was a really cool place I ended up finding out when I found out that said, yes, there's an active shul in one of the buildings nearby in a residential, like they've just built a synagogue in an apartment, and it's been active for more than 100 years. And I thought, oh, this is an interesting story. I'd love to know about the community and everything. And I wrote to them. I'm not Jewish, but I wrote to them and they wrote back going, come on the Sabbath, come join us, sit in the kitchen, talk to us. We'll share you our stories and everything. And they were so wonderful and welcoming. The rabbi got out his palinka, which is like this local fruit brandy. And he's like, I bless this. This is kosher. Enjoy. You know, this is something that we do here. And it was just so interesting to sit down with the people in the kitchen and listen to the history of the community, history of how the community is now. And it opened a lot of doors, like to me in my mind, to think that there's so much more to this city than the main sites.
That's the best. Thank you, Jennifer. Bethany.
Yeah, I'd like to share an experience from my very first trip to Ecuador, which was when I was 24, which is nearly 20 years ago now. And I did a round the world backpacking trip for 9 months and across 4 continents. But it was during that time, it was my visit to Ecuador, which was really transformative and actually went on to transform the direction of my life, really. And I think I only spent maybe three weeks in Ecuador. I first decided to visit Ecuador because I read that in Ecuador you can have breakfast in the Amazon, lunch in the Andes, and dinner on the coast in a single day without setting foot in a plane. So that's when I first decided that I would visit Ecuador. And of that 3 weeks, it was my time in the Amazon, which really was the most transformative for me. And it was one night in particular, I went to stay in a jungle lodge in a national park. And one night we went out in a dugout canoe at night, and the stars were the most beautiful stars I'd ever seen. I could see the Milky Way, and in the jungle, the frogs and the insects make this beautiful chorus. of sound. And so I could see the beautiful stars and I could hear the chorus. And we were in this paddle dugout canoe, kind of paddling through this lagoon. And on the surface of the lagoon was covered in lily pads, and all the lily pads were illuminated by millions of fireflies.
That's
and
beautiful.
it was kind of a miniature city. And I just thought, this is the most magical experience of my whole life. And I carried on traveling. I went to Asia and carried on my trip, but I just couldn't get Ecuador out of my mind after that. And I promised myself that I would return. And actually, the day after that magical experience, it was raining, and our guide, we couldn't do the walk that we planned to do. So our guide decided to give us a talk on oil exploitation in the Amazon. And it was such a shock after having this most magical experience of my life to discover the following day that this ecosystem is under threat from oil. Exploitation had such an impact on me that actually changed the direction of my life, really. So even to this day, 20 years later, that's still the focus of my activism, is oil in the Amazon.
Yeah.
So that was an experience which really changed my life.
When you say change to the direction, I'm curious about what was the direction before?
I suppose, a little bit directionless. Before I kind of tried all the things that I thought I might like to do long term, and I thought none of this is it really. And then I fell in love with Ecuador in that trip. And then 6 years later, I came back to Ecuador, having learned some Spanish, spent 6 months here, and then I knew that I'd found my place in the world. So even though I still wasn't really sure what I was doing with my life, knowing that I'd found my place in the world gave me an anchor around which to build the rest of my life. And that all stemmed from that first initial trip to the Amazon.
So how did that experience impact how and where you have traveled since then? I mean, in terms of Ecuador and other places.
Well, I mean, after my first trip to Ecuador, I did keep traveling, but I just couldn't get Ecuador out of my mind. And 6 years later, I thought I'd discover whether it was just Ecuador that made me feel like that, or other places in Latin America. So I went to do a little bit of exploring in Latin America, went to Panama and Colombia. But as soon as I came back to Ecuador, I felt this dramatic kind of switch, I'm back home, this is where I'm meant to be. So really, in the last 10 years, I've only really traveled within Ecuador because I don't feel I need to leave. I used to have a kind of insatiable thirst to discover new places, but really I feel that thirst can be satiated. I keep here in Ecuador, there's so much to discover here. Really, in the last 10 years, I've only been discovering Ecuador, and I still feel like I could keep discovering the rest of my life.
Yeah. Jennifer, with regard to your transformative experience, how has that impacted how and where you've traveled since also?
I like to I'm a big sucker for off the beaten path kind of places now, and and there's actually quite a thing in Hungary that you'd be surprised that there's a lot of tours ran in Hungarian for Hungarians in like very niche areas. Mm-hmm. So that kind of became like a passionate thing for me, because I unfortunately do speak Hungarian, that I would go on these tours to learn a bit more about the city, and then find something that I could put in that goes things a little bit different and gives a different angle. Because a lot of them are given from the point of view of historians. So, for example, there was an amazing tour up in the Buddha Castle, which is a big tourist area, but has a wide history, where they were talking about during the period of the Ottoman occupation. And there used to be a lot of the Ottomans were living there who were Muslim. And also there was a big Jewish community who'd been there since medieval times, and kind of how they coexisted, and kind of the narrative of how they actually were supportive of each other. And even though nowadays you hear this sort of Jewish-Muslim conflict, and this was apparently not the case back then. They considered themselves as brothers and were more tightly bound together than with the Christian community. And that was quite interesting to learn that was this quite multicultural groups of people up in the castle back in that period of time. And it was from a historian who was specialized in theology. So I got to sort of hear the stories from her, and I did other ones about times during communism here in Hungary and concerns of architecture. And so it was kind of interesting to get a different layer into the city, and that sort of, even in Vienna, I'm not from Austria, but I wanted to go deeper than just the Hofburg and things. And that actually changed my point of view of Austria, because I lived in Hungary for 6 years before going back to Austria. I was like, oh, it's so close, but it's Austria's boring, Vienna's boring. I had that mentality in my head, but I went and I started doing some of these tours. I went on one about the life of Sigmund Freud. And I realized, you know what, history happened here. And there are more stories if you dig below the surface than just the Mozart chocolates and the horse carriages riding through the pretty, very clean and sterile center. And you realize that there's actually so much history, and so much has happened there that influenced European culture, the world today, and such. So that made me get a little bit of a different perspective when I traveled there. And I actually became one of my favorite cities now, actually. I absolutely love Vienna, and I'll go back anytime I have the opportunity, and I find it so interesting. So it taught me to sort of look for the stories beyond what's obvious, and even like the stories of people who are now as opposed to just in the past, because you can go and see how like Vienna is very diverse, which is something you don't think about. There's a big Turkish community there, for example, Asian community. And even in Budapest, I've discovered recently there's a Chinatown area which has got the best food, Asian food that I could find in this part of Europe, in like an old factory area. So it's kind of like interesting to discover that there's more to the cities in these places than meets the eye.
Yeah. So listening to you both talk, especially you, Jennifer, when you talk about how you were listening to the historians and tour guides, and then both of you have done your own self-exploration, I'm just curious about your approach. What are the different points of entry that you use to learn about a place once you get there, or even before you get there?
That's a good question. In my case, I think it's a lot of reading. And when I travel anywhere, it doesn't just count for these regions. When I travel anywhere, I love to read books and literature from those countries. So like I used to work out in India for an adventure travel company. And before I went, I read a lot of books. I did a journalism internship in Georgia. I read a lot of Georgian literature. And I feel it kind of gives you a sense of the character of a place to read. And it's also good to read more diverse literature, get different stories. But that kind of helped me get a little bit more of a context to a place. So I personally think it's a great exercise to not just read guidebooks and things, but read some of the prose and poetry and so on that gets put out by a certain country.
Yeah. I because I wrote about the Civil Rights Trail, of course I had a huge body of work to choose from. And there were instances where I was looking for a very specific piece of data about maybe a small rural place that may not be as well documented as maybe like a bigger city. And I was so excited once when the book that I needed, the author's name was John Dittmer, and I can't think of the title now. It's something People. But anyway, John had everything that I needed in the book, but but I couldn't get to it like in the library. And so I actually called a friend, and she went downstairs in her basement and pulled the book from the shelf, and we sat on the phone for an hour, and I was asking questions. She was looking through the book, and John was giving me all these nuanced answers that I needed to know about. And since then I've gotten a chance to meet him. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, I mean, I have a 3-pronged attack too. Well, not an attack, but approach, in that I always know I want to meet the real people. If you could sit down and have like a real, like local meal with someone, to me, that's like the best thing that you can possibly do to get to really know people one-to-one. And then I've never taken tours before. I guess I've taken a few tours before I started writing my book, but now I think I'll do it all the time, because I just appreciate the perspective that tour guides bring. And I like to take different tours with different tour guides in the same place, so you can see what's different and what's the same, and then like just the shade of difference in even the things that they point to that are the same. So yeah, I got to meet a lot of interesting people, and I can talk to you a little bit about that later. But Bethany, I want to hear more about how you put it together to know the things that you need to know.
Well, I haven't been to a new country for quite a while now, but I do go to new destinations within Ecuador all the time. And for most towns or cities within Ecuador, the kind of central hub is the town square. So I always just head straight to the town square, and they always have a bench where I can just sit, and I just sit and just watch the people go by. And you see everybody. If you're sitting on a town square bench, you just see everybody. You can learn so much about a place just from sitting and watching, I find. So that's always the first thing that I do.
How are you both about talking to strangers?
Depends.
Okay.
A little bit of anxiety, but sometimes people, I reach out to people online in like communities and things if someone seems interesting. And in the past, this is a weird thing. When I started solo travel, I used to go on OkCupid back when it had a forum and it was like blogs and stuff, so it wasn't just dating, and be like, I'm going to Venice and does someone want to have a drink with me? And someone who was like born and bred in Venice was like, oh, why don't we meet up and we go for pizza and I show you around and stuff. So that was interesting. It turned out it was fine and everything and stuff. He did try, but he respected me saying no. And then we were cool and we're still friends, and a few other people. But it was an interesting way of meeting people. But sometimes, like, I find like with the writing background that I have is reaching out to local writers groups, because there's a lot of like English language writers groups, especially in this part of Europe. Mm-hmm. And just saying like, hey, I'm another writer, I'm in town, can I come join you guys for a drink when you hang out? And that's kind of cool to sort of meet, and then you meet other people, and then through friends through there, then they kind of introduce you to other people. So that's how it worked for me. But like in restaurants and bars and cafes and things, sometimes you may have a friendly proprietor or waiter who wants to chat.
Yeah.
And give you books.
Are there any particular authors that either of you would like to suggest that our audience members look at before they head out of town?
Bethany, do you want to go first?
It's been a while since I've been writing about Ecuadorian authors. I'd have to check back on that one.
Okay, that's okay. I can come back to that.
For Hungary?
Yeah,
for Hungary, there's a writer who I really like, who's and she's had books translated into English, is Magda Szabó. And I think her most famous book is The Door, which captures like the period of Budapest in like 1950s in communism. And it was made into a film, and it became quite a well-known book. And I definitely recommend that one to capture that sort of era. And she's a fantastic writer as well. She's got really good nuances about her and her housekeeper. And I'm not giving it away, but it's like a very interesting human story. And in Austria, this is going to be a really weird recommendation, but I really like this book. And I feel it's a very Viennese book, very much like rooted in psychoanalysis and stuff. It's kind of to a cliche extent. It's Arthur Schnitzler's Dream Story, which is a novella. And if you've seen Eyes Wide Shut, that's basically what it was adapted from.
Oh, okay.
The original was set in Vienna. And I just feel it's this kind of morbid, the kind of cliche morbid psychoanalytical kind of story that I feel is very Viennese.
Yeah. You know, my travel has really just shifted my understanding of the things that I would just read naturally. But I think of the themes as being more rooted in place than maybe I did before. So like I just pulled up my phone just to find some audiobooks, because I find it's easier to inhale more books that way. Mm-hmm. I read Clint Smith's How the Word is Passed this year. Even though Negroland is not set in the South, I did read that because it's about a particular, subgroup of Americans and a particular kind of lived experience. So I'm looking at those themes differently now. Let's see. I always had some Toni Morrison kind of like coming through my ears some sort of way, just to kind of keep me grounded and like thinking in a bigger way, to sort of like as a prompt to not be really reductive or like surfacey, when I landed someplace, to take in the story and to meet the people. It's almost like a prompt. She's like just her mere presence. It's just like a prompt to just think deeper about things. So yeah. So with regard to ethical travel, especially you, Bethany, how do you find truly community-supported experiences or businesses and avoid exploitive groups?
Well, I found there's no real kind of easy, quick way to do that from a distance. Actually, I don't think there is a way to do that from a distance. I think I found the only way to do it is to go there and talk with people, meet people, go to the places. It's the only way, which I think is why ethical travel books are so useful, because somebody who has obviously not everybody has the time to do that, investigate like that. But that's why I think ethical travel books are so important, because somebody like me who lives in a place can do that work, write the book, so people who are planning their journeys and want to travel ethically have that information to hand from a distance. So, I mean, really, I found, for example, in Ecuador, there's a nature reserve up in the north, and in the Amazon. These are kind of eco lodges, as it were. And my first trip to Ecuador, I kind of assumed that was ethical travel because they all helped to take care of the Amazon. What I didn't realize, and what it took me digging further to find, was that all of these lodges are owned by wealthy people from Quito or foreigners. And these lodges are in the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples. And these indigenous peoples have their own grassroots kind of eco-tourism initiatives. They just don't have any budget to market, so people don't even know that they exist, basically. And these people, the indigenous people who live there for thousands of years, generally get employed in these lodges to drive canoes or cook or clean the rooms, but they don't have any decision-making power within these lodges. They're just kind of, you know, minimum wage employees, really. And when I found that out, I was kind of outraged, you know, especially when I discovered that, you know, for these indigenous peoples, community-led ecotourism provides them with a sustainable source of income, which allows them to kind of protect their Amazon and their culture and have decision-making power within their own territory. And I only discovered that by going there and talking to people. So I kind of, for that, I found I kind of stumbled across the Amazonian network of permaculturalists. So I went there and I talked to the woman who, she basically bought a piece of destroyed Amazon forest and she renovated it through permaculture techniques. And so I thought, here's somebody who will know about what's ethical in this area. So I went to speak to her, and she said, she put me in touch with various kind of indigenous activists from different communities, all of whom had their own community-led ecotourism initiatives, and I went to meet them, basically. And that's how I found that's how I discovered this information. And there's another place in Ecuador, which is one of the most well-known organic farms in the country, and it's recommended in all the kind of ethical guide, you know, information online, because it's organic and, you know, people can go and visit there. But actually, when I went,
Oops. Okay. While Bethany logs out and logs back in, that's probably what she's going to have to do. Jennifer, do you want to talk about how you find community-supported businesses?
So I think there's a different issue that I kind of want to address here, because I think the issues in European cities is different to what you would have in these eco farms in Ecuador. Is the Airbnb thing. And I'm wondering if a lot of people have heard that there's this controversy, especially in European cities. So in a city like Hungary, in a country like Hungary, the wages are actually much lower than you would have in other European countries, but apartment rates have gone up comparably like because of Airbnb. Has been a lot of landlords prefer to rent out an Airbnb to foreigners who can pay higher rents than to locals, and this is pushing a lot of the locals out of the city and causing a lot of gentrification issues. So this is something I think a lot of people are not aware of, because you have this thing pushed as Airbnb as being like, oh, this is a nice way to live like a local and so on. And I kind of did that. I would stay in someone's spare room and stuff. And I think that's, but I still now I wouldn't use Airbnb. But the more I see how the rent prices have increased and how it's getting much more difficult for Hungarians to live sort of anywhere in the center of the city now with the Hungarian wages. And I think this is not just in Hungary. I think in Barcelona and other cities in Europe, this is becoming a big problem. So one thing, if to avoid exploitative things, I would say avoid Airbnb. If you maybe find like there's some smaller hotels, if you don't want to go to the big chains, there's some nice, there's some interesting ones actually that are more ethical. Like for example, in Vienna, there's one called Magda's, which is run, actually they employ refugees in the staff there. So there's some interesting like hotels that actually give back to the community and so on. So I would recommend going to somewhere like that rather than booking an Airbnb, just because it is causing problems for locals.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Minal is here, so I'm going to yield the floor to Tiffany to introduce Minal. Hi.
Hey. Yes. Hey, Minal Hajratwatla is here. I'm just going to give a brief introduction so we can get back into the conversation. Minal, she wrote Leaving India, My Family's Journey from 5 Villages to 5 Continents, and it's a winner of 4 nonfiction awards. She's also the author of Bountiful Instructions for Enlightenment and the Moon Fiji Travel Guidebook. She edited Out, which is stories from the new queer India, and co-founded the India Poetry Collective and created the Unicorn Authors Club to help authors finish books. Another amazing author. So please welcome Minal.
Hey everyone, thank you so much. And I apologize for being late. I have had all kinds of technical troubles today, even though I'm not even in Fiji, alas. I'm in the US, but still having trouble. But I do have my my coconut water
Okay,
from
great.
Costco, you know.
Just a second ago, Bethany got disconnected. We were talking about avoiding exploitive experiences, groups, and businesses. And Bethany, I wanted to make sure that I gave you an opportunity to complete your thought, and then I can kick the question over to Minal.
Yes, I was just going to say that there's a well-known organic farm here in Ecuador, and I assumed that that would be a good ethical travel option until I went and spoke with the local people and discovered that this organic farm basically kind of treats people as slaves there, and there's really been nothing but damaging on a social level to the local people. And although they might take care of their lettuces, you know, they don't take care of the local people at all. And I was absolutely shocked to find that out, and I literally could only find that out by going there and talking to people. So that's all I was going to say, really.
Thank you so much. So Minal, you have any insights for us?
Yes, I think actually this is a great question, because this is the one of the reasons that it's really helpful to have actual journalists and researchers writing travel guidebooks, and as a traveler to use a guidebook rather than just sort of the TripAdvisor reviews, which are great, but they're just other travelers passing through. And those of us who are doing the research for our books, we have a chance to get to know things a little bit locally. In my case, in Fiji, I have a lot of family there, so I also had, you know, their insights and their kind of insider perspectives on where to go, and Fiji is a little bit different than many other places that that we think of as vacation destinations and that have a big reliance on tourism, because in Fiji, the indigenous people own 87% of the land. And so even the big, you know, sort of corporate travel chains and resorts, most of them are leasing their land on long-term leases from local communities and tribes. And so they have agreements in place that include profit sharing and wages, and usually a certain number of staff that are hired from the community that is directly adjacent to the resort and that owns the underlying land and the surrounding waters that a resort is based on. So there are some institutional governmental protections against exploitation in Fiji that that prevent, I think, the worst of some of the things that Bethany was talking about. On the other hand, there's, you know, of course, everywhere a big distinction between the places that are truly locally run, that are owned and operated by local folks. And that's what I try to focus on in my research and my recommendations in the Moon Guide to Fiji. Partly because, you know, there's an ethical concern, but also because I think that's where you get the best experiences as a traveler. It's just so beautiful to be in a place and know that the person welcoming you into your lodging for the night or for the week also knows that land and is welcoming you to their home and their community. So that's an experience that I love having in Fiji.
That's wonderful. Well, the one thing that I did to control for what I call extractive storytelling in my journalism, I'm really concerned about just, swooping into communities, taking what I need and going back downtown to the office to write the story about people as if we didn't talk to the people, and really reflected their experience, right? And so the one thing I did to control for that in my book, because it's a story about the Black experience. It's about American history, but it's about the Black experience. Unless otherwise stated in my book, I'm sending you to a Black-owned business. So I don't think that's something that reflexively happens in travel writing, where there's an effort to cross that difficult line to the other side of town that the tourism people may not be thinking about or maybe investing in. But I don't know how you can asset frame the communities that you care about if you don't spend time with those communities. So that's my 2 cents.
Absolutely.
So let's see. Let's talk about the idea of privilege. And what does that mean for you? And what does that mean for the kind of traveling and writing that you do? Jennifer?
Yeah, I think especially with the political climate going on here, especially in Hungary, which is not the best at the moment with regards to racism, homophobia, and Islamophobia, and so on. And I do have a lot of friends, people of color, who have been having issues. Fortunately, no violence, but getting stared at or getting slurs, especially sort of a lot of Asians or Indians and so on. So there is, I think, traveling as a white person, I don't experience that same level of anxiety as someone who is a person of color traveling, and also someone who's traveling here who's LGBT. After the recent laws that have been passed here in Hungary, I can imagine that they would have a lot of anxiety coming here too. Budapest, I think, fortunately, is quite cosmopolitan, and I think there are a lot of safe spaces for people here. I think it's, in terms of the LGBT, it's more of an issue for people who live here rather than someone traveling through here, because it's more like you don't know what's going to happen. But I think there is a difference between I think between traveling in Vienna and traveling in Budapest as a person of color, because Vienna is much more diverse. If you go in Vienna, you see people of all races, religions, and so on, and that's kind of norm. It's a very diverse, cosmopolitan city. It always has been. And I think because Hungary for a long time had been homogeneous, especially under communism, I think for people, even if it's not coming from here, I think the racism issues is more directed towards Roma. So I think if you were coming from, say, for example, South Asia, people may think you're Roma and may treat you differently based on that. Because I know some Indian friends who've been called gypsy and stuff like this and getting slurs like that. But so I think, yeah, and in terms of privilege, I think definitely in this part of Europe, being white is a huge thing. And I think my experience and someone of color would have a different experience here. But there's a fantastic blog here in Budapest called Black Girl in Budapest, who talks about Black experiences, Black businesses, and so on. So I highly recommend checking out her stuff.
So that reminds me of a TikTok, a person that I like to follow, Kia Tanise. She's in Paris, and she's a Black girl, and she talks about all her stuff.
Yeah.
Minal, how about you?
Yeah, I'm really, I love this question. I'm really aware of privilege when I travel. And in Fiji, I experience, of course, as a person of color, I experience mixed things when I travel around the world. But in Fiji in particular, I experience 2 kinds of privilege. One is being an American. And so everything that brings, including our passports where we can travel and American dollars, which are worth about twice as much as the Fiji dollar. So, that just opens up a lot of things that are unequal in the power dynamics going on. And also just being a tourist versus a local, sometimes there's a gap there. And also, particularly in Fiji, the Indian population is more of a kind of, some part of it, including the part that my family is from, is more of a merchant and business owning kind of population. There's a whole other Indian population, which is quite rural and farming. And then there's the indigenous Italki population. And then there are a handful of Europeans, white Australians, and New Zealanders in Fiji. So there's quite a big mix of folks, and definitely there is a racial hierarchy. And so I'm really aware of that when I travel, and know that there might be things that I have access to or ways that I'm treated that are more respectful or more polite than what other folks could be experiencing. And I'm also queer, so I'm just aware of that as I travel. Fiji is pretty safe for queer people. We don't see a lot of violence or hate crimes. Crime in general in Fiji is really quite low. But it's also a very religiously conservative country, and so there's not a lot of social acceptance either. And so I think that affects probably local Fijians more than it does tourists. With tourists, I think people are sort of used to seeing everything and just look the other way. But it is respectful to, it's not a culture where there's a lot of public displays of affection, for instance, even among straight people. So.
I want to hear from Bethany, but I also want Minal and Jennifer to think about, I'm interested in the nuances of what you just described. So Minal, when you talk about being more respectful, like think of a situation that you could tell us about in just a second, okay? Okay, Bethany, on privilege.
Well, Ecuador is a place where a lot of the colonial structures are still very much in place. So a lot of the elite in Ecuador are descended from Spanish, so are white. There's still lots of indigenous people here who generally get discriminated against sometimes. Also Afro-Ecuadorians who are descended from escaped slaves. So there's still quite a set hierarchy here in Ecuador. So as a white woman, I feel I receive a lot of preferential treatment here when I'm traveling around in Ecuador. I feel that I'm granted a lot more freedom than local women. Local women are expected to conform socially. For example, local women are generally expected to live with their parents until they're married. There's no living on your own or living with friends or, traveling alone as a local woman, especially, I'm not married, I don't have children. That's unheard of here in Ecuador. But I'm granted freedom to be strange, to be a non-religious, vegan, single, non-parent is fine for me, but a local woman would really be under massive pressure to conform. And so I feel more free than local people, but I also feel a lot more welcome than, say, immigrants from Venezuela. We have a lot of people coming in from Venezuela. Whereas I get called an expat, for example, a word which I really disagree with strongly. I don't feel that white wealthy people should have their own word. I feel like I'm an immigrant. So the person coming in from Venezuela is an immigrant. We're just people who used to live in different places, and now we live here. So I feel a lot more welcome than somebody from Venezuela, for example, but I have a lot more freedom than local people. And I also feel that I'm able to explore much more freely than a person with disabilities, for example, because that infrastructure doesn't really exist here in Ecuador. So I feel extremely privileged to be when I'm traveling around here in Ecuador.
Yeah, I'll come back to you, Jennifer and Minal, in just a second. But I want to tell you a little story of something that happened when I was in Mississippi, in the Delta. I went to one of the Emmett Till museums in the Delta, the one that's in a small town called Glendora. It's located in a former cotton gin, which is where they got the oversized fan and barbed wire to wrap around Emmett to dispose of his body. And the museum is run by the mayor of the town, whose father was actually implicated in disposing the body. This is really, really deep. Anyway, so I go through, I can't take any pictures or document that way. So had to be, just take copious notes, as I went through. And I talked to the mayor and his family members before I went in and had the museum experience. And when I came out, I was waiting to approach him to thank him for his hospitality and just to connect with him, just so that it's beginning of a relationship, right? And so he's talking to a woman who walks in and she's carrying like a briefcase and she's walking really kind of like self-important, and she's having a conversation with him. And I'm like maybe 6 or 8 feet away, and I can see her looking at him and then looking at me and looking at him and looking at me and pointing. And I'm like, okay, I've covered small towns before. I think I might know what this is about. So I step up to her and I'm like, hello, I introduce myself. I'm like, can I answer any questions for you about what I'm doing here, what I hope to accomplish? And so she's like, why are you here? What are you going to do with what you learned here? Are you just going to take the credit for everything? Are you just going to just document this and write your little book and go up north and get famous? Like, are you going to make money and not give any of the money to the people in this community who need it? Like, she had some like real serious questions. Do you know that people do this all the time? Do you know they don't even give us credit for the things that we tell them? And so I just slowed it way down and I just talked to her about my process. I talked to her about my value system as a journalist. And then I flipped my privilege. I had big city book contract privilege, right? But also my people are from Mississippi. So I started making those connections. Like, oh, I actually started my career here 30 years ago, and this person and that person, and started, weaving and making those connections. So at a certain point, she calms down, she's fine with me, and she turns to the mayor and she goes, well, I'm done with you today. I'm hungry. I'm going to get something to eat. And I said, excuse me, I'm hungry too. And so we ended up, I followed her to a place that was on my sheet that I wanted to eat at. And we went and had dinner. And she brought a woman whose parents won a Supreme Court lawsuit. It was a wonderful night.
Wow. Okay. How beautiful to turn that around.
Yes, and we're still friends. We were texting last weekend. But yeah. So I want to come back to Jennifer and Minal about like those specific, like nuancey type opportunities that you have to make that adjustment for privilege.
Go ahead.
In what sense? Could you elaborate a little bit, please?
Okay, well, maybe I'll go to Minal, because what I was really thinking was when you said that in some instances, Minal, you may be a little bit more polite. And I'm just trying to, I would like for you to paint a picture of like where you are, where you know that you have to make this mental adjustment. Is it something about the age of the people in the room, the family dynamics, just the how power moves in a particular area where that, oh, I'm going to get much further if I slow this down and I display respect in a way that this community can understand and appreciate.
Yeah, it does. Yes. One thing that comes to mind is that because my extended family is kind of a business owning family in Fiji, they are actually used to a certain kind of treatment from other Indians and other Fijians. And so there'll be times when like one of my uncles is just walking around showing me something, and someone comes up to him and says, oh, hey boss, and I'm like, oh, does that man work for you? And he's like, no, they just all call all of us boss, which to me is a little shocking and, appalling. And at the same time, when I've been sometimes places, like I was on when I was researching the book, I went to a small hotel on a secondary island, and to get there, I took the regular passenger ferry, which is sort of a 7-hour journey on a not a tourist ship, like a very local kind of cargo ferry passenger ship, and you take a bus to get to the ferry, and it's all very sweaty and all of that, and people were like, kind of like, what are you doing? Like my family was like, why are you taking that route? Like you should you should take the plane. And I'm like, no, but I'm writing about the process of travel. And so I need to take this way. And they're like, don't. But, it was fine. And it was not, I think that when I have been traveling in the more kind of privileged way, that I've actually missed things. Like, it was a beautiful ferry ride and a nice view, and it's fun to see like all the things that people take on the ferry, like their big baskets of vegetables because they're going to go sell them on the other island, or they're like kind of bundles of mechanical goods, and just seeing like, oh, all the things that have to be imported from the main island to these smaller islands gives you a really different sense of what it's like to be there. And for me, those are some of the most precious moments of travel, is really getting that kind of insight.
That's great. If my question made sense for you, Jennifer, I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about your experience.
Okay, so I think it's a little bit different because in Europe, in Austria, for example, I think I didn't find that much difference in the nuances between Vienna and the countryside, but in Hungary, there's a huge difference. And maybe that's because I come from that point of view, being able to speak the language and having family here. Mm-hmm. But if you go outside of, so people come to Hungary, mostly they go to Budapest. And some may go to Lake Balaton or do some day trips, but often they won't go into rural Hungary. And rural Hungary is different. My family, for example, comes from this area that's kind of like the Hungarian Rust Belt. It's like a very poor part of northeastern Hungary that used to have factories. And you go there and you really don't feel like you're in what you would associate with Europe anymore when you go there. There's like a lot of very semi-abandoned houses, a lot of poverty, and so on. So I think that can sort of take people a little bit, like especially if they're traveling around the country by bus and they go through rural Hungarian villages, and especially like not just in Hungary, if you go into the Balkans or places like that, it is a bit of a, if you're not used to traveling around this area, it's interesting. I personally like seeing the way that people live in these. It's sad to see that because I know the socioeconomical situation by that with friends of family and people from my mom's hometown, but it is eye-opening. And it does give you a different perspective that not all of Europe is this sort of fairy tale land that I think there is this stereotype of what it is. Yeah. But the other thing is that's interesting in Hungary is that there was a survey I remember seeing about Europe saying that the countries that worst with foreign languages is UK and Hungary. UK, you understand English, everyone speaks English, but in Hungary, it's a very difficult language, very obscure, not related to any other languages. There's a theory it's related to Finnish, and so the Finno-Ugric, even then I don't understand a word of Finnish. But if you leave Budapest and go away from the tourist trail, you'll find that maybe it's going to be difficult because not that many people speak English. So that's something to bear in mind, that if you do want to like go off the beaten path in Hungary, unless you've got someone who does speak Hungarian with you, that can be a challenge.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. So we have about 8 minutes left, and I want to ask you a question, and I want you to answer as brief as possible, but I think it could be useful for our audience. And I actually want to skip to documenting travel, and maybe talking about best practices and taking pictures and recording stories. And maybe if you could like share like one particular practice or thing that you do. Because trust is so important. Trust is important in the moment with the people that we're engaging with, but also the trust when we leave. So I'll start with Bethany, and then I can go around. Okay.
Well, I find this part of it quite difficult because I'm English, and I'm quite introverted. So my worst nightmare is to intrude on anybody's privacy or anything like that. So I find that aspect of it quite difficult. I'm just as polite as I can and always ask permission once I've plucked up the courage to actually go and ask. That's the hardest bit for me.
Great, thank you. And Jennifer?
Yeah, like Bethany, I have this British anxiety of being impolite and offending people by asking. But I find if I'm like chatting with someone and then we have a little bit of a connection, then I will ask to take their photo. But I think for my destinations, my focus is more on architecture and places and nature and things like that, because I think that's what people come to Europe for. And I think for me in Budapest and Vienna and cities like that, for me, it's the details. Like there's so many beautiful details you just have to look up. One of my architect friends said, always look up when you're in these cities.
Great, thank you. Minal.
Yeah, I don't take pictures of people generally unless either I know them or personally, or they are doing a very public performance where lots of people are taking their pictures and that's part of the environment, or if they are specifically selling something and then I speak to them, I ask them, I tell them, you know, I'm doing this travel guidebook and I'd love to take your picture with your art or craft. And it, you know, it would reach an audience that maybe would travel here and come to see you in your shop. So, and that I've done in artisans markets in Fiji. There are these beautiful carvings and those kind of things. So you'll see pictures of people that I take in those environments. Other than that, I really don't take photographs of people. And in Fiji, it's mostly landscape. There's so much to photograph and the attractions. And then I do have some pictures of my nieces, which which they consented to.
Got you. Yeah, I ask a lot of permission too before I step to people. Like if it's like a singular person, like you said, Minal, like if it's not like a group environmental sort of thing. And I prompt myself to slow down in explaining, because a lot of times I'm just moving quickly, like I'm thinking about the next thing and the next thing. So I have to remind myself to slow down, because if you can slow down and look people in the eye, this is where, you know, the trust is going to be engendered. Like you really do care about them and only them in that moment. There have been cases where I may have seen like the same guy ride a bike up and down the street, maybe in front of a mural that I knew that I was going to take a picture of. And it would have been great to have that. And like I was running up and down the street in Memphis once trying to catch this guy, but I just couldn't do it. And I try to like be really specific in how the photo is going to be used. Like, you know, everybody traveling is not writing a book, but you know, I'll mention my social media channels, where to find me, or if I have time to exchange their information, so I can make sure to tag them. You know, people appreciate when you can circle back to them and include them in on the entire process. Yeah. It is, well, 1:57 Eastern, Tiffany. Am I good? Do we have time for one more question, or do I need to wrap it up? Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question. And that question is, how should travelers prepare themselves for the most authentic journeys, journeys that can lead to transformation?
Turn off your phone and internet and just be where you are.
Good advice. And hard. Bethany, what comes up for you?
I'm saying just be really open to, don't have any expectations of how people should be. Also, don't judge people by your own standards. Often what you would consider bad manners is perfectly fine in another country, but what your manners might be quite offensive to them. So just be aware that manners are different in other countries, and be open to whatever you find, I would say.
Great. Jennifer?
I would say learn a few key phrases of the language of the country you're going to, because even like please and thank you and hello goes a really long way. And after, you know, if they notice that you're struggling, then they will switch to English, but the attitude will be a bit more positive.
That's great. I'm going to say something that's really controversial. Forget the calories. Just eat.
I want to take it.
Hold on. I agree with that advice.
So we're 2 minutes away from our closing, and Minal, we missed you on the front end. And so I just wanted to make sure that we circle back to you and give you an opportunity to share any insights with our audience that can really make travel more meaningful for them.
For me, it's a lot about connecting with the land, the water, and the people. And, you know, depending on the location, it could be one of those more than the others. There's definitely vacations where I'm like, this vacation is all about me and the ocean. It doesn't matter, you know, who else is there and what else is around. And then there's other times where it's really about the people, and other times it's really about the land and getting to know another part of our beautiful planet.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Minal. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Bethany. Thank all of you out there in virtual land. Have a great weekend. Tiffany.
Yes, now it's time to say goodbye to all our wonderful company. Yes, thank you all so much, Deborah, Jennifer, and now Bethany. Thank you all for being here. And a big thank you to Moon Travel Guys for making this all possible. And a special shout out to Crystal, who's been our wing woman behind the scenes, putting this together. Thank you as well. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. And before we end this up, just to let you know, we actually want to invite you all to attend Wonderful's membership and enrollment event that is coming up on August the 28th. I'm going to put it in the chat here. This will be actually a great time for you to join, because our membership prices are going to increase significantly right after that. And this is a good time for you to pick the founder's brain, Beth Santos, about what Wonderful is about. Wonderful is a great community of women all around the world where you can find your next travel buddy, get tips and resources on how to plan your next vacation. We have daily live virtual events as well as in-person events all across the country. So please join us. It's called What's Wonderful About Being a Member on August 25th at 12 p.m. Just make your RSVP there on Eventbrite. And we want to thank you all for joining us today. So be well and safe and have a wonderful day.